Hello. I want to speak with you briefly today about the so-called New Perspective on Paul. For those of you enrolled in New Testament Orientation 2, this topic is taken up both in Discussion Board 2 as well as the final research paper for those who choose Paul's understanding of the law as their topic. Dating back to the work of Harvard Dean Krister Stendahl, the New Perspective argued that the usual conversion model of Paul, the Jew, who gives up his former faith to become a Christian, is not the model of Paul, but is a fiction of our own devising. Subsequently, scholars such as E.P. Sanders, James D.G. Dunn, N.T. Wright, to name a few, further suggested that the traditional perspective represented by the conversionist model and the prominence of the principle of justification by faith over against legalism has misunderstood Paul at very critical points. They argue that the typical perspective on Paul, accepted uncritically as fact by most, was crafted in the Reformation as a reaction, they would argue overreaction, to Roman Catholic legalism and ritualism. Consequently, these New Perspective scholars argue the Reformation went too far the other way, in so emphasizing grace to the exclusion of right conduct that Paul's theology got caricatured, trivialized, and misinterpreted as cheap grace. They argued that Paul, in the traditional conversionist understanding, is reduced to saying, God loves to forgive sins and I love to sin. Hey, is this a great world or what? These New Perspective scholars argue that this traditional perspective, the so-called sola fide theology of justification by faith alone, with only a tip of the hat to moral earnestness, is in error and a misrepresentation of Paul's thought, in that, they argue, Jews never understood law-keeping itself as a means of salvation. Rather, these scholars insist that when you actually look at what first-century Christians taught and believed, you will find that Jews understood law-keeping as evidence that they were saved, not as a method of being saved. The traditional perspective understands Jews to have believed, I obey, therefore I am accepted by God. Paul, the traditionalists argue, repudiated this perspective as legalism. However, the New Perspective says that this is a misrepresentation of Judaism and a misreading of Paul. They argue that Jews never understood law-keeping as a means of salvation. For a Jew, it was all about covenant, they argue. That is, the fact that Jews were God's chosen people and had entered into an agreement or contract or covenant with God, which included blessing on God's part and right conduct as evidence of their chosenness on their part. Jews already believed themselves to be the chosen people of God. Therefore, their view was, I am accepted by God already, therefore I obey. Consequently, the advocates of the New Perspective argue that Paul did not have to repudiate a view no Jew believed in the first place. Rather, Paul's view was the same as every other first-century Jew, with one significant addition. Namely, he added the atoning work of Jesus Christ, rather than election as the chosen people of God, into the mix. I am accepted by God through the atoning work of Jesus Christ, Paul believed. Therefore, I obey. Now the question is, who is right? The traditional conversionist model, or Sanders, Wright, Dunn, and the advocates of the New Perspective on Paul? Which is the better and consequently more faithful understanding of Paul's intention as revealed in his letters? The debate rages on. Therefore, it is not surprising that some have sought a mediating position and have argued for both continuity and discontinuity between Paul and Judaism. See, for example, J. Christian Becker's Paul the Apostle, the Triumph of God in Life and Thought, and Bruce Longenecker and Todd Still's Thinking Through Paul, a survey of his life, letters, and theology. Longenecker and Still, for example, argue that Paul's thought included both conversionist language that emphasizes his discontinuity with his former life as a Jew, and call language that emphasizes continuity between the pre- and post-Damascus Paul. And so, now that you have a better perspective on this whole debate, how do you read the letters of Paul? Was his break with first century Judaism as radical and final as the traditionalists suggest? Or do you side with the New Perspective scholars who find much more continuity between Paul and first century Judaism than the traditional understanding has previously admitted? Till next time, take care. God bless.